Pedro wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and looked at his watch. It was 6 p.m. and his workday had ended. He had spent all day laying bricks, cement, and tiles at a construction site near the Grand Palace Luxury Hotel, the most elegant and exclusive in the city. Pedro felt proud of his work, even though it was hard and poorly paid. He was an honest and hard-working bricklayer who had earned a living with his own hands since he was young. He didn't care about money or appearances, he just wanted to be happy and have peace. Pedro stored his tools in his old truck and prepared to go home, a modest house on the outskirts of the city where he lived alone since divorcing his wife 5 years ago. But before starting the engine, he felt an irresistible curiosity to see the interior of the Grand Palace Hotel. Pedro had participated in the construction of that hotel a few years ago when he worked for a contractor company. He had laid many of the bricks and tiles that formed the walls and floors of the hotel, but he had never been able to see the final result. He had always been told that the hotel was only for rich and famous people, that he had no business being there. But Pedro wasn't intimidated by those words. He knew he had as much right as anyone to enter the hotel, even if only for a few minutes. After all, he had contributed to its construction and felt a special connection to that place. Pedro got out of the truck and headed to the hotel entrance, not caring about his appearance. He wore his work clothes, torn and dirty from dust and sweat. His shoes were worn out and his hands were full of calluses and wounds. His hair was black and curly, and his face was dark and weathered by the sun. Pedro was a simple and humble man who didn't worry about his image, but upon entering the hotel, Pedro realized he was out of place. The hotel was an imposing and luxurious building with a marble and glass facade and a large golden sign that said Grand Palace. The interior was even more impressive, with elegant and sophisticated decoration and dim, cozy lighting. The hotel was full of people, but not just any people. They were people dressed in expensive suits and shiny jewelry, who spoke with foreign accents and moved with an air of superiority. They were the hotel guests who had come to enjoy their vacations or their business in the city. Pedro felt like an intruder, like a stranger in a world that wasn't his. But he didn't let himself be intimidated by the looks of contempt and mockery that the hotel employees and guests threw at him. Pedro walked with a firm and decisive step through the lobby, ignoring the comments and whispers that were heard around him. "What is that man doing here?" asked a thin blonde woman wearing a red dress and a diamond necklace. "He looks like a beggar," replied a bald, fat man wearing a gray suit and a gold watch. "He must be lost," said a beautiful young brunette wearing a blue dress and high heels. "Or maybe he's a thief," suggested a tall, thin man wearing a black suit and a red tie. Pedro heard those words but ignored them. He knew those people were superficial and arrogant, that they only cared about money and appearances, and that they had no idea what hard work and sacrifice were. Pedro felt superior to them because he had something they didn't have, dignity and honesty. Pedro headed to the hotel bar where he sat at one of the tables and ordered a beer from the waiter who attended him reluctantly and with contempt. Pedro didn't care and prepared to enjoy his drink and his moment. Pedro wanted to see how the hotel had turned out inside and admire the work he had helped create. Pedro felt happy and satisfied, not knowing that his life was about to change forever. Pedro was savoring his beer and observing the hotel bar when his gaze met that of a woman who was sitting at a table with a man. Pedro felt a chill as he recognized that woman. It was his ex-wife Lorena, from whom he had divorced 5 years ago. Lorena was a beautiful and ambitious woman who had always dreamed of a life of luxury and glamour. She had met Pedro when they were young and had fallen in love. Pedro had loved her with all his heart and had offered her everything he had, but Lorena had not been content with that. She had wanted more, much more. Lorena had started demanding that Pedro change jobs, earn more money, dress better, move to a bigger house, buy her jewelry and designer clothes, take her traveling around the world. Lorena had started to despise Pedro for his bricklayer status, for his torn and dirty clothes, for his lack of education and manners. Lorena had started cheating on Pedro with other richer and more powerful men than him. Pedro had endured all that out of love, for the love he still felt for Lorena. Pedro had tried to please her, to give her what she wanted, to save their marriage. But nothing had been enough for Lorena. She had ended up asking him for a divorce, telling him that she didn't love him, that she had never loved him, that she had only used him. She had ended up breaking Pedro's heart, leaving him alone and devastated. Pedro had taken a long time to overcome that breakup, to forget Lorena, to rebuild his life. Pedro had decided not to fall in love again, not to trust anyone again, not to suffer again. Pedro had decided to be happy with what he had, with his work, with his friends, with his house. Pedro had decided never to see Lorena again or know anything about her. But now fate had wanted them to meet again in the least expected place, in the Grand Palace Hotel. Lorena was there, sitting with a man who seemed to be her partner, an elegant and rich man who wore a silk suit and a gold ring. A man who smiled at her and whispered in her ear while caressing her hair. A man who offered her everything she had desired. Lorena was also there, dressed in a lace dress and high heels. Lorena also smiled at him and responded while kissing his cheek. Lorena also offered him everything he had denied her. Lorena saw him, Pedro, sitting at the bar with his bricklayer clothes, with his beer, with his gaze. Lorena recognized him and was surprised. Lorena got up from her seat and approached him with a firm and arrogant step. She wanted to talk to him, she wanted to humiliate him, she wanted to tell him to leave the hotel, that he didn't belong in that place. Lorena wanted to show him that she had triumphed, that she was happy, that she had forgotten him. Pedro saw her, Lorena, walking towards him with her lace dress, with her high heels, with her smile. Pedro recognized her and got angry. Pedro stayed in his seat and waited for her with a serious and calm gesture. Pedro wanted to listen, he wanted to ignore her, he wanted to stay in the hotel that was his place. Pedro wanted to show her that he had overcome, that he was happy, that he had forgotten her. Pedro and Lorena looked at each other fixedly without saying anything while the silence grew between them. Pedro felt a mixture of anger and pain seeing the woman who had been his wife, who had betrayed and abandoned him. Lorena felt a mixture of shame and resentment seeing the man who had been her husband, who had not been able to give her what she wanted. "What are you doing here, Pedro?" Lorena asked with a cold and haughty voice. "I came to see the hotel," Pedro replied with a calm and firm voice. "To see the hotel?" Lorena repeated with disbelief and mockery. "And what do you have to do with this hotel?" "Much more than you think," said Pedro with pride and confidence. "Don't be ridiculous, Pedro," Lorena said with contempt and sarcasm. "This hotel is only for people like us, not for people like you. You have nothing to do here. You don't belong in this place." "People like us?" Pedro asked with irony and defiance. "And who are you, Lorena? Those who think they're better than others for having money and power? Those who forget their roots and their values? Those who sell themselves for a bit of luxury and glamour? You have no idea, Pedro," Lorena said with fury and arrogance. "You're the one who has no idea what life is, what success is, what love is. You're the one who settles for a miserable and boring life, with a slave job and a poor house. You're the one who stayed behind while I moved forward and made a place for myself in the world." "A place in the world?" Pedro asked with pity and compassion. "And what place is that, Lorena?" "That of being the mistress of a rich old man without scruples. That of being the envy of a few gossipy and graceless old women. That of being the mockery of all who know the truth about you." "Enough, Pedro!" Lorena shouted with rage and shame. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. Don't you dare judge me. Don't you dare insult me. You are nobody to me. You mean nothing to me. You are nothing." "Nothing?" Pedro asked with sadness and resignation. "Is that how you see me, Lorena? Is that how you remember me? As nothing?" "That's right, Pedro," Lorena said with coldness and cruelty. "You are nothing and you've always been nothing. Nothing more than a bricklayer. Nothing more than a failure. Nothing more than a nuisance. That's why I left you. That's why I forgot you. That's why I hate you. You hate me, Lorena? Pedro asked with surprise and disappointment. Why do you hate me, Lorena? What did I do to you? Didn't I love you, Lorena? No, Pedro, you didn't love me, Lorena said with lies and cynicism. You never loved me. You never wanted me. You never made me happy. You only made me suffer. You only made me cry. You only made me waste time. That's why I hate you, Pedro. Because you ruined my life. Because you took away my illusion. Because you stole my youth. Pedro couldn't take it anymore. Lorena's words hurt him like daggers in his heart. Pedro felt his soul breaking, his sight clouding, his mouth drying. Pedro wanted to say something, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain himself, but he couldn't. No words came out, no tears came out, no air came out. Pedro could only take out his cell phone that had rung at that moment. It was a call from his lawyer, Carlos. Pedro didn't know why he was calling or what he wanted to tell him. Pedro just wanted to escape from that situation, from that woman, from that pain. Pedro just wanted to be alone, in silence, in peace. Pedro answered the call without looking at Lorena, without listening to the man accompanying her, without caring what they thought or said about him. Pedro just wanted to hear Carlos's voice, his friend, his counselor, his confidant. Hello, Pedro, it's Carlos, said Carlos's voice with a cheerful and enthusiastic tone. Hello, Carlos, it's Pedro, said Pedro's voice with a tired and dull tone. Pedro, I have incredible news for you, said Carlos's voice with excitement and expectation. What news, Carlos? Asked Pedro's voice with curiosity and reluctance. Pedro, your uncle Ricardo has died, said Carlos's voice with regret. My uncle Ricardo? Asked Pedro's voice with confusion and astonishment. Yes, Pedro, your uncle Ricardo, the multimillionaire businessman, the owner of several hotels and tourist complexes, the one who never paid attention to you or loved you, said Carlos's voice with irony and admiration. And what does that have to do with me, Carlos? Asked Pedro's voice with indifference and resignation. Pedro couldn't believe what he heard. Carlos's words sounded like a dream, like a joke, like madness. Pedro couldn't understand what was happening or why it was happening or what it meant. Pedro couldn't assimilate the news or the consequences or the implications. Pedro couldn't react or speak or think. Pedro could only remain stunned while Carlos kept talking to him with enthusiasm and joy. Pedro, this is incredible, this is wonderful, this is fantastic, said Carlos's voice with euphoria. Pedro, you have to come to my office as soon as possible to sign some papers and receive your inheritance. Pedro, you have to see the documents that confirm that you are the sole beneficiary of your uncle Ricardo. Pedro, you have to see the credit card that gives you unlimited access to your bank account. Pedro, you have to see the keys and property titles of all your uncle's assets, including the Grand Palace Hotel. Pedro, you have to see what awaits you, what you deserve, what has fallen to you. Pedro still couldn't believe it. Carlos's words sounded like a tale, like an illusion, like a lie. Pedro still didn't understand anything or want anything or feel anything. Pedro could only hang up the phone without saying anything, without doing anything, without knowing what to do. Pedro was left alone in the bar with his bricklayer clothes, with his beer, with his gaze. Pedro was left alone in the bar without knowing that his life had just changed forever. Pedro left the bar and headed to the hotel exit without looking back, without saying goodbye to anyone, without caring about anything. Pedro just wanted to leave that place, that situation, that nightmare. Pedro just wanted to go to Carlos's office, his lawyer, his friend, his savior. Pedro got into his truck and started the engine without paying attention to traffic, to signs, to traffic lights. Pedro just wanted to arrive as soon as possible, without delays, without obstacles, without problems. Pedro just wanted to know the truth, the reason, the meaning. Pedro arrived at Carlos's office, a small and modest office in the city center where Carlos attended to his clients, mostly humble and hardworking people like Pedro. Pedro got out of his truck and entered the office without knocking, without waiting, without hesitating. Pedro found Carlos sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers, folders, documents. Carlos saw him enter and got up from his seat with a smile on his face, with joy in his voice, with emotion in his look. "Pedro, friend, how good that you came," said Carlos with effusiveness and cordiality. "Carlos, friend, how good that you called me," said Pedro with sincerity and gratitude. "Pedro, friend, I have something to show you," said Carlos with mystery and expectation. "Carlos, friend, I have something to ask you," said Pedro with curiosity and anxiety. Carlos took him by the arm and led him to his desk, where he showed him the documents that confirmed that Pedro was the sole heir of his uncle Ricardo, the multimillionaire businessman, the owner of several hotels and tourist complexes, the one who had never paid attention to him or loved him. Carlos explained to Pedro that his uncle Ricardo had died of a heart attack a week ago and that he had no wife or children, only a nephew, Pedro, whom he barely knew but to whom he had decided to leave all his fortune and properties for some reason only he knew. Carlos told Pedro that he was his uncle Ricardo's lawyer and that he had received the will a few days ago where it was specified that Pedro was the sole beneficiary of everything his uncle owned, including the Grand Palace Hotel and other tourist complexes. Carlos told Pedro that all that was his, that he could do whatever he wanted with it, that he could enjoy his new life as the owner of everything his uncle had. Carlos told Pedro that he was rich, very rich, immensely rich. Pedro didn't know what to say or what to do or what to think. Pedro was left speechless, gestureless, reactionless. Pedro was paralyzed, stunned, overwhelmed. Pedro could only look at the documents, the card, the keys, the titles. Pedro could only touch them, feel them, verify them. Pedro could only believe them, accept them, assume them. Pedro realized that it was true, that it was real, that it was his. Pedro realized that he was rich, very rich, immensely rich. Pedro felt an indescribable emotion, an inexplicable sensation, an unforgettable impression. Pedro felt that his life had changed, that his destiny had turned, that his dream had come true. Pedro wanted to thank Carlos, wanted to hug Carlos, wanted to celebrate with Carlos, but he couldn't. His voice didn't come out, his gesture didn't come out, his spirit didn't come out. Pedro could only look at Carlos with a mixture of amazement and bewilderment, of joy and fear, of illusion and doubt. Pedro could only ask Carlos with an almost inaudible voice, with an almost invisible expression, with an almost impossible intention. "And now what, Carlos?" Pedro asked with uncertainty and confusion. "And now what do I do, Carlos?" Pedro asked with concern and worry. "And now what am I, Carlos?" Pedro asked with anxiety and expectation. Pedro left Carlos's office and headed to his truck with the documents, the card, the keys, and the titles in his hands. Pedro felt strange, confused, overwhelmed. Pedro didn't know what to do or what to think or what to feel. Pedro had just found out that he was the sole heir of his uncle Ricardo, the multimillionaire businessman, the owner of several hotels and tourist complexes, the one who had never paid attention to him or loved him. Pedro had just become the owner of everything his uncle owned, including the Grand Palace Hotel and other tourist complexes. Pedro had just become rich, very rich, immensely rich. Pedro didn't understand why his uncle Ricardo had left him all his fortune and properties, or what he wanted to tell him with that gesture, or what he expected from him. Pedro didn't know his uncle Ricardo, didn't feel affection for him, or hold a grudge against him. Pedro only knew that his uncle Ricardo was a powerful and successful man who had made himself, who had worked hard and triumphed in business. Pedro only knew that his uncle Ricardo was a lonely and bitter man who had no family or friends, who had not been happy or made anyone happy. Pedro wondered if his uncle Ricardo really loved him or just used him to punish his son Miguel, who had been disinherited by his father for being irresponsible and wasteful. Pedro wondered if his uncle Ricardo really admired him or just envied him for his simple and honest life, for his dignified and honorable work, for his true and humble happiness. Pedro wondered if his uncle Ricardo really respected him or just despised him for his bricklayer status, for his torn and dirty clothes, for his lack of education and manners. Pedro didn't know what to think of his uncle Ricardo, or what to feel for his uncle Ricardo, or what to do with his uncle Ricardo. Pedro only knew that his uncle Ricardo had changed his life, had given him an opportunity, had set him a test. Pedro decided to return to the Grand Palace Hotel, the hotel he had helped build, the hotel his uncle Ricardo had left him, the hotel that was now his. Pedro decided to return to the Grand Palace Hotel to confront Lorena and Miguel, those who had mocked him, those who had betrayed and abandoned him, those who now feared and hated him. Pedro decided to return to the Grand Palace Hotel to enjoy his new life, his new fortune, his new power. Pedro entered the hotel with a triumphant attitude and headed to the bar where he looked for Lorena and Miguel, who were sitting at a table with an expression of surprise and fear, with an attitude of submission and repentance, with an intention of forgiveness and reconciliation. He approached them and told them that he was the owner of the hotel and that he was going to throw them out on the street, and he showed them the documents that accredited him as such. Pedro told them that he was the heir of his uncle Ricardo and that he was going to disinherit them, and he showed them the credit card that gave him unlimited access to his bank account. Pedro told them that he was the owner of all his uncle's assets and that he was going to leave them with nothing, and he showed them the keys and property titles of all the hotels and tourist complexes. Pedro told them all that with a firm and clear voice, with a serious and severe gesture, with a cold and hard look. Lorena and Miguel were left speechless and couldn't believe what they saw. Lorena and Miguel felt humiliated and ashamed, defeated and powerless, guilty and unhappy. Lorena and Miguel realized that Pedro was the owner of the hotel and everything his uncle owned, that Pedro was the heir of his uncle Ricardo and all his fortune, that Pedro was rich, very rich, immensely rich. Lorena and Miguel realized that Pedro was the only one who could save them, the only one who could forgive them, the only one who could make them happy. Lorena and Miguel realized that Pedro was the man they had loved, the man they had betrayed, the man they had lost. Lorena and Miguel realized that Pedro was everything and they were nothing. Lorena and Miguel knelt before Pedro and asked for forgiveness, begged for clemency, pleaded for mercy. Lorena and Miguel told Pedro that they loved him, that they wanted him, that they needed him. Lorena and Miguel told Pedro that they had deceived him, that they had used him, that they had forgotten him. Lorena and Miguel told Pedro that they had made a mistake, that they had repented, that they had reformed. Lorena and Miguel told him all that with a trembling and broken voice, with an anguished and pleading gesture, with a tearful and desperate look. Pedro listened to them and looked at them without saying anything, without doing anything, without feeling anything. Pedro listened to them and looked at them and felt betrayed and disappointed, deceived and used, forgotten and hated. Pedro listened to them and looked at them and felt superior and indifferent, powerful and immune, rich and unhappy. Pedro listened to them and looked at them and realized that he didn't love them, that he didn't need them, that he didn't forgive them. Pedro told them to leave, that he hated them, that he never wanted to see them again. Pedro told them to leave and threw them out of the hotel and left them on the street and forgot them forever. Pedro was left alone in the bar with his bricklayer clothes, with his beer, with his gaze. Pedro was left alone in the bar with his documents, his card, his keys, his titles. Pedro was left alone in the bar with his fortune, his power, his solitude. Pedro was left alone in the bar and realized that money didn't make him happy, that success didn't fulfill him, that love didn't await him. Pedro was left alone in the bar and wondered what he had done wrong, what he had done right, what he had done. Pedro was left alone in the bar and regretted having entered the hotel, having seen Lorena, having inherited from his uncle. Pedro was left alone in the bar and missed his life from before, his bricklayer job, his poor house. Pedro was left alone in the bar and cried.